Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is our fifth and final webinar in our series. We are school counselors for MTSS. I am Dr. Jennifer Betters-Buban, and I'm excited to be with you today to talk a little bit more about heading back to school. If you were able to catch our previous webinar that Dr. Goodman-Scott and I presented last week, we talked a lot about systems. And for today, we're going to think more about a trauma-informed approach. So you can see our contact information. We are on Twitter, we're on Facebook. And if you want additional information related to this specific presentation, just text MTSS to the number that you see on our screen. Our webinars will be available on our website and on our YouTube channel. So you can always come back and get additional information. As we get started, I want to acknowledge my team, school counselors for MTSS, Emily Goodman-Scott, Peg Donahue, and Jake Olson. The four of us have come together and all contributed to a book, The School Counselor's Guide to Multi-Tiered Systems of Support. As a former school counselor and current school counselor educator, I found my people, and I found them in our shared love for creating systems that will meet the needs of students, staff, families. And so that's what we do. That's what we love to do. And that's why we have put together this webinar series for all of you. And know that we have more. We have actually 4 different webinars in our series. And you can, again, check those out on our website, schoolcounselorsformtss.com, as well as our YouTube channel. So we have a number with specific content in mind, so crisis, grief, and even just thinking about MTSS in your virtual school counseling program. I know many of us are in a state of uncertainty as to what we are going to be doing in the fall, and so that may be a good one to just bookmark in the event that you stay virtual. I also want to give a quick acknowledgement to my mentor, Dr. Dave Van Doorn. He is a colleague who passed away a number of years ago, and it is because of him that I am able to provide this information to you today. He was a trauma expert and insisted on coming to all of my school counseling classes to talk with the students about trauma, adverse childhood experiences, knowing that they needed this information in order to function successfully in their roles in schools. And so I offer this acknowledgement to him because I wouldn't be here providing this information to you without his guidance and all that he taught me. So for today, overview, gonna provide some information on MTSS, just a brief refresher, get into a bit about trauma and the impact of trauma on the brain, and then move into thinking about a systems approach in which taking a trauma-informed multi-tier systems approach as you approach your school year, ending with a little bit of information on self-care. So refresher, this is the same refresher that we have provided in every one of our webinars so far, so it will not come as a surprise to you. We are interested in multi-tiered systems of support. Many of you are likely familiar with the triangle that you see. MTSS is an overarching term, and so as former school counselors, we are interested in both prevention and intervention, and MTSS has been a guiding framework that has allowed us to think about how we serve students both academically and behaviorally. And so that it often is an umbrella term, and there's other ways. I know in Wisconsin, where I am from, it's referred to as multi-level systems of support. You're going to see a lot of different acronyms, knowing that it is an umbrella term for the frameworks that we utilize, like RTI or PBIS, to address the needs of students and create positive outcomes. We like to conceptualize a triangle, obviously, thinking about, from a school counseling perspective, what do you do for all students, tier 1? What do you do for some students at tier 2 in terms of targeted interventions? And what do you do in tier 3, those more intensive interventions? as school counselors, and the reason we created the School Counselor's Guide to MTSS was to really consider how to align that with our Ask a National model. So the diamond that you see in the upper corner is our national model. So how do we align those two frameworks together so that we are working smarter, not harder? As a group, we actually did that. So we created this visual. This visual is available free, downloadable on our website, as well as on our Teachers Pay Teachers site. It is a free download where we really looked at the 2019 most recent Ask a National model and aligned it within the systems and structures of MTSS. So thinking about how school counselors specifically provide direct and indirect preventative activities and practices for all students. So that includes some of the school counseling lessons that we do. That includes some of the trainings that we provide to all teachers, all families. How do we align our work across Tier 2, those direct and indirect services that we provide so often, including those individual small group counseling. Some districts refer to that as SAG groups, social academic instructional groups. And how are we working in consultation and collaboration with the different stakeholders in our schools? Finally, the Tier 3 indirect services. For the students that have chronic needs in specific areas, how do we wrap around them? And across the side, we thought about the elements of the Ask a National model. So the define, how we ground what we do within mindsets and behaviors, how we ensure that our belief, mission, vision, goals are aligned with the school, with the district, with the multi-tiered systems teams. How are we utilizing evidence-based, culturally responsive practices, particularly at Tier 1? And how are we assessing throughout? So you can find that. We hope you find it helpful to just think about how you can organize the important work that you do with schools and within systems. Also with MTSS, we know that we are trying to impact outcomes. The goal is to create systems using frameworks like what I mentioned in the previous slide, utilizing data to find out what's working in terms of our practices. And so previous webinars have focused extensively on really thinking about your systems, particularly as we go back to school. And so for this webinar, my hope is that I can help you think more about practices, specifically trauma-informed practices that can guide your work as you re-enter the new school year. And how can you do that in a virtual way? How can you do that in a face-to-face way? So here's what we know. What we know is that we have experienced a collective trauma with COVID-19. There's been, this has been a public health emergency, and we are in the midst of that still. We have been isolated from family. We have been isolated from our schools. We've been isolated from each other. And so because of this public health emergency, we have been impacted, some of us directly, if we have gotten a diagnosis of COVID-19, others indirectly, just thinking about our own safety, thinking about the well-being of individuals and our communities. Thinking there's so many different impacts that we are facing as a society as we think about this public health emergency. And what we know is that's going to lead to a range of emotional reactions and unhealthy behavior. Our health and safety has been impacted, and so we are going to respond accordingly. If you haven't, I would definitely recommend that you check out George Sagai's keynote from MTSS Fest. You can do this. We have a link at the end of our presentation. You can also Google or look at this within YouTube. It's available. But he spoke extensively about this new normal and how we get to think from a systemic perspective that many different aspects of our society have been impacted we're in kind of this during phase of COVID-19, and then thinking about how that might extend to afterwards. So we are going to be specifically thinking about the new normal within our educational systems, knowing that there's going to be overlap that impacts the impact in housing is going to impact students and how they're able to access education. But the focus for us for today is going to be thinking about education. What we know in our new normal, we are in the midst of this public health crisis. And so what we can anticipate are some of the things that are alongside this slide. Increased parental substance abuse. We can anticipate that there is additional exposure to domestic violence on the part of students. Given the level of stress that parents are experiencing, given the economic instability, the number of people who have lost jobs. We can anticipate that despite the fact, actually I was just reading an article about this before I hopped on this webinar, child abuse reports have gone down significantly since we have been isolated from school. And this is not necessarily a good thing. Schools are where we can track and where we can note changes in behavior of our students. And so we can anticipate that we will need to respond to this when we return back to school, and even now. We know that families have been impacted economically, that there has and will continue to be increases in poverty, increases in individuals losing their homes. And so a lot of what is coming out in the news is this idea that our next pandemic is one related to mental health. That because of COVID-19, this is going to exacerbate already underlying mental health issues on the part of students, staff, and within families. And so we get to be thinking about that. We get to be thinking about which students may need more support, particularly those who have anxiety, depression, etc. And we also know that families have been impacted greatly. Families have been separated. They don't have the same level of support. And we know that there's been grief and loss that hasn't been processed other than in a virtual setting. So we know families who are having funerals at a later date. We know that there are communities who have been struck by suicides of students and community members who have been having to really respond to that crises in different ways. And so that's not going to go away. And we can anticipate that we will be trying to help students and families with this when we return to school, hopefully in the fall. And so because of this, I'm going to put forth that one way we can cope with this range of emotional reactions, this range of unhealthy behaviors, is to engage in trauma-informed MTSS practices. So what does that mean? So let's talk a little bit about trauma before we get to the actual practices, so that we have a grounding in what the impact of trauma on the brain, on learning and behavior. So what is it? Trauma is an exposure to a distressing experience or an event that overwhelms a person's ability to respond. So it can be acute, historical, it can be complex. We are all engaged in kind of a collective trauma right now. And there are going to be a variety of different responses, whether those are acute responses. It's going to depend on what an individual might bring into the collective trauma that we're all experiencing. And so something we get to think about are individuals who already may have experienced adverse childhood experiences or ACEs. If you haven't, I would absolutely recommend that you take a look at Nadine Harris-Burke's TED Talk, all about ACEs and the ACE study. Also would highly recommend reading the study below, the Folletti and Ande study, that really talks about the intersection between adverse childhood experiences and health outcomes. So these three categories: abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, and how those are related to how we function as individuals later on in life. We know that there's a dose effect. So the more ACEs that an individual has, the more likely they are going to experience negative health outcomes. We also know the higher doses of abuse, neglect, or dysfunction has an impact on how we are functioning in terms of our brain and what aspects of our brain we are utilizing to engage in problem solving, to engage in relationships. So I definitely recommend additional reading on ACEs. And what we know is that, so COVID-19 may have a direct correlation, potentially, to individuals who are experiencing more abuse or additional mental illness in their households, substance abuse, things of that nature. Even neglect. We know that, so there may be an increase in students who experience adverse childhood experiences as a result of our current public health crisis. What we know also is that trauma, exposure to trauma, impacts the brain. And there's a lot of words on this slide, and so you can always pause or go back to this. But the important takeaway from this slide is really knowing that when we've experienced trauma, when we are in a state of fear, when we are not feeling safe, our thinking brain shuts down. And this is good. This is a good survival mechanism because we may have to, right? If we are scared, if we are not feeling safe, we may engage in fight or flight. And so that can be a good thing. It's not necessarily a good thing when we're going to school. And if we are considering that we're feeling unsafe, even in situations where we no longer are. Okay, so we know that trauma impacts how we react. We also know that trauma across time impacts the brain. It actually changes how we think. So again, I'm going to give a shout out to Bruce Perry. If you haven't, I would recommend reading The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. We have links and visuals of all of these recommendations at the end of this presentation. Because we know that trauma impacts how we function, the state-dependent functioning. And so what we know is that individuals who experience more trauma tend to function more in the brainstem or midbrain rather than in the cortical brain. So they are more likely to be functioning from a place of survival versus a place of critical thought. So I also have a link here to Bruce Perry describing a really, it's probably about a 8 to 10 minute YouTube clip in which he really talks in depth about state-dependent functioning. And it's important for all of us to know as we think about students and teachers and staff and families who are coming back to school, recognizing that they may be in a different space than we may be. And because of that, we know that trauma impacts learning. It organizes our ability to even think about cause and effect. It impacts our ability to pay attention, to regulate, to engage in executive functioning. Trauma also impacts behavior. So what we can anticipate is more reactivity, more impulsivity, more aggression, defiance, withdrawal, and even some perfectionism. So we should anticipate this as we think about coming back to school. So kind of grounding us again, we have this collective and potentially individual traumas. We know that trauma impacts the brain, which then impacts how we are functioning and our behavior and learning. So what do we do? So we get to think about which trauma responsive practices we can engage in within our MTSS. School is one of the safest places for kids, and that's regardless of the level of violence, neighborhood, and many other factors. So we can take heart in that. Schools are good places. We choose to be in them. And so just in and of themselves, we get to think about schools as being really grounding. We also get to think about what else can we do to ensure that when students and staff and families come back to school that the environments are truly trauma responsive. So let's think about that from an MTSS perspective. Let's think about MTSS as our organizing framework where we think, okay, so what can we do for all? And this should be our primary starting point, because if we're not doing it for all, then we're going to have many, many more students who are going to need intensive services. First, we get to think about the fact that individuals who have undergone trauma have a difficult time with trust. And so we need to, and we get to think about how we build our relationships and how we help staff build relationships upon our return to school. So thinking about that unconditional positive regard, how we have to check some of the assumptions we might have, and how we get to serve as a relationship coach for others, how we get to model this behavior. I love this quote. Every student asks 3 questions about their teacher every day. Can I trust you? Do you believe I can succeed? Do you care about me? We get to model that, and we get to help teachers and staff who have been through a similar collective trauma reground themselves in this idea of relationship. How do we do that? Well, we might need to start with some closure activities from the school year. Many of us had an abrupt end to this school year and weren't able to close out some of those relationships. So are there any school-wide activities, any shared art, any school-wide projects that would allow for some closure? This may involve students visiting their previous teacher or spending time in their previous classroom, if they're able, and we get to think about how we would structure that in the event that there are students who are new to the school, and how we could use that as a learning opportunity. But what can we do to kind of close out on that previous school year? And then once we do that, we get to know our students again, and our primary goals for the first weeks, month of school should be getting to know our students again and thinking about how can we reteach, remind, acknowledge positive school-wide expectations? How can we reteach school-wide routines? And those routines might look different post-COVID. Those routines may look different given social distancing requirements that we have in place. So we're going to be juggling a lot, and we're going to get to be rethinking about how do we reteach even how you greet someone now that we no longer may be able to touch each other. We get to consider evidence-based social emotional learning curricula as we engage in this work, because we know that they work, and we know that they will help ground students and staff. We get to think about focusing on the positive and avoiding the punitive. Again, remembering all that we just learned about the brain, knowing that some of our students are going to be coming to us in a state of fight or flight. So we'll get to think about how we can set up some strategies for students at the upper levels, the upper tiers. We should think about how we are going to find those students who might need additional support. What types of universal screening can we do? We have a list of some resilience surveys at the end of this PowerPoint that may be helpful in allowing you to think about which students you may need to support more. We also get to think about how are we going to engage families. Families have been incredibly disengaged from schools, and families have been incredibly stressed. What do families need in order to re-engage with the school, feel safe at the school, and know that their students are safe being at the school? What about tier 2? So we might want to think about some immediate check-ins with students who weren't engaged in the online environment. Are you tracking students whom kind of fell off the radar, for whom students perhaps filled out a Google form that said, you know what, this person is not logging off? What about check-ins with students who you had on your list prior to the shutdown of school? Students with previous mental health or behavioral concerns. What are some reentry activities that you can do, whether that's lunches, whether that's setting up a mentorship program, whether that's being present in their classrooms a bit more, whether that's small group, individual support. So you get to think about how are you and your team going to proactively meet the needs of students who may have been more disengaged. Again, with tier 2, you're going to be thinking about your screening response, right? So if you're going to do a universal screener, that is going to be provided to all students. Not all students are going to need follow-up. So what types of follow-up are you going to have in place? Is that check in, check out? Are you going to do some, again, some mentorship programs? Are you going to do some social academic instructional groups? And throughout this process, how are you going to consult and collaborate with parents and families? Really, really important. Finally, at tier 3, basic needs are going to be critical when thinking about individuals who may have tier 3 needs in terms of food, shelter, supplies. All of those need to be in place before a student or a family is even going to be able to engage in schoolwork. What are some ways you can integrate some dysregulation strategies? So strategies that would allow students to re-regulate. I know a lot of schools who have put into place some really great sensory rooms that allow for regulation, where students aren't sent, that students go to with perhaps others, and at least with a caring adult, where they can find ways to move from move into their prefrontal cortex. So getting out of the more primitive areas of the brain. And sometimes that has to be done through sensory and regulatory activities. What partnerships, and some of the tier 3 strategies really are going to go back to Dr. Goodman-Scott and my PowerPoint from last time when we talked about how do you set up some systematic supports, because you will want to have some community agencies that you can go to who you know. You can send some students who have more intensive needs. Are you going to have a school-based mental health counselor on your staff? And again, how are you going to tie in and how are you going to collaborate with parents and families? This is not something that is done to students and families. This is done with parents and families. The goal, of course, is that there is post-traumatic growth. I really like this slide. It is through this process of struggling with adversity that changes arise that propel individuals to a higher level of functioning, which exists prior to the event. That's our goal. Our goal for all students, staff, and families is that, yes, we have adversity, and what we want is we want to propel individuals to be better than before, if at all possible. And so what we know, when we think about post-traumatic growth, one of the most common factors to develop resilience is supportive relationships. That can be with staff, that can be with parents or caregivers or another adult. So what can we be doing in our schools, through our schools, around our schools to help develop relationships? Okay, so that could be school-wide events where parents and students and staff all come together. We can teach people about resilience, that resilience is actually a thing that works, that happens, that it is possible. So in sum, we know that we are experiencing trauma, but we get to think about how we help students, staff, and families reframe how they think about trauma in the brain. We get to engage in relationship, and we can utilize our existing systems to make those relationships move to the forefront, particularly in the first weeks of school. What we also know is that this is hard work. And so we cannot engage in this work without self-care. Because there could be, and there may be symptoms of vicarious trauma for those of us who are working with individuals who have been exposed to trauma. So we get to think about that, and we really need to be mindful. We get to be mindful about what our needs are. In each of these webinars, we have commented about how important it is to remember we can't fill from an empty cup. And it's really incredibly important when we're talking about trauma. So who are your partners that you are going to consult and collaborate with? This is not work that is going to be done in isolation. This is work that is going to be done in collaboration. You get to consider all of the different factors, the ethics, what materials are we going to be using, being really mindful and thoughtful and deliberate in the processes that you're engaging in, and really advocating for those individuals that don't have a voice within this process. We know there's so many other resources out there, and I'm going to point out a few here. Our webinars, of course, as I mentioned previously, are a great resource, particularly as you're thinking about crisis and grief. Those would be very helpful alongside of this webinar. And also so many wonderful resources on trauma. So I put together just some things that you can read. Some excellent books that I highly recommend. Ross Green's work is fantastic. Ways that you can learn. So through Wisconsin, on their Wisconsin DPI website, they have trauma-sensitive schools learning modules. These would be great exercises to engage in with staff. They also have an entire toolkit on compassion resilience. Again, thinking about what we all need as we move forward, really, really important. And also some resources that you can watch. So Nadine Burke-Harris's TED Talk, a couple of really excellent documentaries, Paper Tigers Resilience, and a new documentary by Ross Green that is all about the kids we lose. So thinking about how we can change our systems. We have a resource for you as well, and this is linked on our website. I filled out only the bottom helpful resources because I wanted you all to have an opportunity to use this as a planning document. Thinking about heading back to school, what are some trauma-informed approaches? What can you do for all students? What are you doing for some students? What are we doing for a few? You likely already have things that you can fill in. And now it might be a matter of tweaking to really think about focus on relationship within the 3 tiers. And finally, these are many of the resources I've been mentioning throughout, with links so that you can read when you are able. And these are the resilience screeners that I mentioned. There's so many good ways in which to inform yourself, inform your staff, and take care of each other during this time. We would love for you to stay in touch through Twitter, through Facebook. Again, if you need additional information, go ahead and text that number, and then there will be a form you can fill out to provide your email address. I appreciate all of you. I appreciate the work that you continue to do, the work that you continue to engage in. And I look forward to hearing more about that work.